if your goal is to get a traditional publishing contract, should you just write one book and stop, or is there something else that's going to make you stand out a little bit more? One of the things that we talk about when it comes to those traditional book deals is that you actually have to be prepared, because your first book that you get an agent for and then have them shop it around to the publishing houses may or may not actually get you a deal. So there's a couple things you need to know. When it comes to creating more books to send to an agent to then shop around to publishing houses, you always want to make sure that you have as many as possible. Keep going and keep creating, but do not create in the same series, because most publishing houses will not buy a series. They will buy a standalone book with the potential of being a series. And then based on how that book sells, then they'll decide if they're going to buy book 2, book 3, and beyond. So you should not, and they specifically say you should not be writing book number 2 or book number 3 or book number 10 inside of this series if you actually want a book contract for it, because you're going to dramatically change book 1. It's just something that happens inside of the publishing industry. They will be changing things whether you like it or not because you signed that contract, and then everything else could get shifted and tilted if they do something major that's going to change book 2 or book 3 and beyond. So we don't write books 2, we do not write book 3, but we have ideas for that. You can outline it, you can prepare to write it, but not actually write it. But we do want you to continue to write your stories, because you should be working on more than one book, because they may or may not like the first book you put out there. So let's say you've written a book, you've got your agent for it, because we know we always work with agents if we're going to a traditional publishing house, because the mid-level and smaller level publishing houses just aren't worth it anymore. And it's even debatable whether the big publishing houses are worth it at this point for a lot of people, unless you are their top person that season. So you want to make sure you go through an agent and they're shopping around your books. Now, a publishing house may like your first book and may grab it, but that's pretty unlikely. It's usually a pretty long process that takes a couple of years to get to the point of actually getting your book out in the world after it's purchased. So then you want to make sure you've got multiple options for them. So if a company didn't like your first book, they might like your second book. In fact, back when I first started, I was querying my books around the different publishing houses. I had several houses love my books, but they decided the one that I had given to them was not the one for them this season. But they loved me, they loved my work, they wanted to see more, and they asked if I had other stories. Those were the books that they tried to buy. So my first book got me in the door, it got me noticed by them, but they didn't end up buying that one. They tried to buy the second ones or the third ones that I offered to them because those were a better fit. So when you, as a writer, have multiple options, you are less likely to get those no answers and more likely to get a book sold in a traditional writing space. So you should always write your book, do your best to edit it as best as possible, get that agent, and then start shopping that around to publishing houses, and then immediately start working on the first book of another series or another standalone so that you've got different options for people to be working on. Now, let's just say you don't like the idea of not writing your second or third book because you really want to. But if you do spend your time then writing the second and third book, but the person doesn't want to buy the first book, you've just spent all that time on a series they're not going to buy. So instead, you've written one book here, and you've written another unrelated book here. Now you've got 2 opportunities to get those book contracts. So this is a really good idea for you. The second you finish one book, you can start shopping it around to agents who will then potentially sign on with you and shop it around to the publishing houses to sell your manuscript. You should immediately start working on another unrelated book so that you have multiple options to hand multiple companies, and best case scenario, you get contracts for all of those books. Worst case scenario, one gets you in the door and the other gets sold. So you've got a lot of options there that you can then move forward with as you are creating your stories. If you've got questions or comments on this, now's the time to drop them down below.